Statistically, an airplane is considered the safest means of transportation. And it's true that plane crashes are not as frequent as car crashes. Nevertheless, anything can go wrong in the air. An airplane can have engine failure, collide with something, or passengers can be thrown out of it. Watch this episode to find out what happens in this case. The Croatian Frane Selak can be called one of the luckiest and most unlucky people in history. On the one hand, he constantly got into various troubles, but on the other hand, he always got out of them successfully. For example, in 1962, he was riding a train which derailed and drowned in an icy river. Frane got ashore with only minor injuries. In 1966, the bus on which he was riding, Frane fell into the river. The Croatian received only a few cuts and bruises. In 1970, Frane got out of the car that caught fire, which after a few seconds exploded. In 1973, he almost burned down because of a faulty fuel pump. And in 1995, he was hit by a bus at high speed. Do you know what Frane did after he was thrown a couple of dozen meters? He got up, shook himself off, and refused medical attention, saying he was late for a meeting. He later got into accidents again, and in 2002, he bought a lottery ticket that brought him about $1 million. Still, the Croatian's luck peaked in 1963. He was flying the DC-8 plane between Zagreb and Rijeka when, in the middle of the flight, the door of the plane suddenly opened. The Croatian and the rest of the passengers were thrown out of the plane at an altitude of about 1.8 miles. 19 people died, but Frane landed safely in a soft haystack with only a few bruises and abrasions. That's incredible in itself, but what's even more incredible is that the haystack was the only one within a radius of several miles. There a luckier man than Frane? Perhaps there is. For me, Vesna Volovic can be called the luckiest one, for she has an even more impossible experience. In 1972, she was a flight attendant on JAT Flight 367, which flew from Stockholm to Belgrade. The plane exploded 45 minutes after takeoff at an altitude of 6.2 miles. Everyone on board was a victim of the crash, but not Vesna. Even though she fell from a height of 6.2 miles, she managed to survive. Not unlike Frane, she got away with more than a few scratches. She was badly injured and slipped into a coma. But the flight attendant came out of it quickly enough and lived a long life. After the crash, the luckiest woman in history worked in another airline office. According to her, she had no fear of flying because she didn't remember the very moment of the crash. The same cannot be said for Larissa Savitskaya, another woman who was born under a lucky star. In 1981, she was flying an AN-24 plane when it collided with a long-range bomber aircraft over Zvinsk, Russia, at an altitude of more than 3.1 miles. Soon, the plane crashed into the Amur Taiga. Larissa was the only survivor of that terrible crash. She was unconscious for several hours, but when she came to her senses, she realized that she couldn't even move on her own. Because the crash occurred in the middle of nowhere, rescue workers arrived only 2 days later. The woman miraculously managed to survive not only the crash itself, but also 2 days alone among the wreckage and bodies, barely keeping warm and chasing away the huge taiga mosquitoes. She was seriously injured and later paralyzed, but she was able to recover. Subsequently, Savitskaya was listed twice in the Russian edition of the Guinness Book of World Records. What happened to Larissa, Vesna, and Crane is only a small part of what can happen to aircraft. They can make very nasty landings, get caught in tornadoes, and cross paths with other planes. Let's take a look at all of these and other creepy, unusual, and exciting aviation incidents that will impress and frighten you. Everyone who's flown in an airplane knows that the most dangerous phases are the takeoff and landing, because these are the moments when most crashes occur. Everyone wants a good takeoff and a soft landing, but that doesn't always work out. These pictures show a plane with Russian tourists landing at an airfield in Peru. It's hard to call the landing soft. The plane is shaking a lot, as if it were riding on a washboard or bumps. It seems like the landing gear was about to fall off or the plane would crash into something, but it worked out fine. The 2014 incident made the passengers of the two planes nervous because they almost collided with each other at Barcelona airport. The Argentine Airbus was on the runway, while the Russian Boeing was coming in for a landing. The Airbus was taking off, and it was as if the pilot hadn't seen the huge plane coming from behind. Fortunately, the situation was saved by the reaction of the pilot of the Russian Boeing. He decided to halt the descent and make a second approach. It's horrible to imagine what would have happened if the airliners had collided, because something similar has already happened, also in Spain, but in Tenerife. In 1977, 2 planes collided on the runway, and 583 people died. A collision can happen not only on the runway but also in the air. But air traffic controllers do everything possible to separate 2 planes flying at the same echelon or altitude. In this case, one aircraft is commanded to gain altitude and the other to descend. From the cockpit, such a safe air encounter looks beautiful. See for yourself. Everyone knows that planes land on a runway, but it's not always nearby. An airplane may get into an emergency situation. It may run out of fuel or something else. In this case, pilots have to act non-standard way. For example, the pilot of this Cessna airplane decided to act boldly but competently and landed the bird of steel right on a roadway somewhere in America. I should say the landing was very smooth and soft. Landing gear smoothly touched the road, and the pilot didn't hurt anyone. The drivers should also be praised since they reacted quickly and gave way to the unusual road user. And this is what an emergency landing straight from the cabin looks like. It may look like a landing approach after a long flight, but no. In fact, this is an Aeroflot Superjet that flew from Moscow to Murmansk in May 2019, but was forced to return to Sheremetyevo International Airport about half an hour after takeoff due to malfunctions. The first touch was very rough. The plane flew up and then hit the runway with its belly, sustaining damage and catching fire. Panic broke out on board. The plane braked for several seconds before coming to a complete stop. The images of the burning plane and the screams of the passengers are truly frightening. In the same year of 2019, there was another similar episode, which was also filmed from the cabin. The AN-24 airplane was landing in Nizhneyangarsk, Russia. As you can see, the plane lands and starts rushing along the runway as if it's not going to stop. Its speed doesn't drop. At first, it seems to be no big deal, but soon it becomes uncomfortable because the runway is not endless. As a result, the plane rolls first on the ground and then beyond the runway, crashing into the sewage treatment plant. The collision was abrupt, but a second later it was over. All the passengers fortunately survived, but only at the cost of the aircraft commander and flight mechanics' lives. You can find quite a few videos of plane crashes on the internet, but none of them are nearly as gruesome as this one, if you ask me. The video was taken by a DVR in 2013 in Afghanistan. We see a huge plane taking off. It's clear from the first few seconds that the plane looks like it's overloaded because it's flying very slowly. Soon it tilts to the left, then to the right, and then abruptly loses altitude. Within seconds, the plane goes into a stall and hits the ground with its belly, followed by a terrible explosion. Thanks to the driver's DVR, we can see the crash up close and in great detail. As it turns out, this cargo plane was loaded with armored vehicles. As it took off, one of the armored vehicles broke off of its mounts, ripped the hydraulic system, and bent the screw jack of both horizontal stabilizers, pushing them to their extreme position. That's why the airplane started to wobble so much. Because of the low altitude, the pilots didn't have a single chance to correct the situation. Let's take our minds off the bad stuff and look at other aviation cases. For example, the power of airplane engines. Standing behind an airplane while it's taking off is a very bad idea. Look at what became of this minivan. The thrust of the turbines threw it away like a toy, and yet it weighs several tons. The jet fighter's even more powerful. It was as if the pilot had deliberately demonstrated thrust before takeoff. A small push was enough to blow away several people, as well as railings, and at full power, such a jet could cause serious injury. If you find yourself on the island of St. Martin in the Caribbean, I recommend visiting the beach. What makes it different from all the others in the world is that there's an international airport right behind it. The runway is adjacent to the beach, separated only by a small road. For this reason, planes take off and land literally over the heads of holidaymakers. Of course, it will not be possible to reach the plane with your hand. After all, the height is about 33 to 66 feet, but such a spectacle is still impressive. Where else have you seen planes flying so low over people? In this episode, there's also a place for helicopters. In this footage, we can see all the power of the elements. A helicopter flies up to the tornado, trying to get to the victims and help them, but the tornado ruins all the pilot's plans. The terrifying vortex rapidly sucks the helicopter into itself, and it begins to rotate around the tornado. Pilot quickly realized that things were bad and ejected. It was the right decision. A few seconds later, the tornado completely engulfed and destroyed the helicopter. Did you know that helicopters not only fly around tornadoes, but also transport animals, including rhinos? And no, they're not put in the cockpit of the helicopter. These giants can't fit in there. Rhinos are transported like this, suspended. They're tranquilized beforehand, then strapped to a helicopter with their heads down, because that, according to scientists, it's the best position, and then taken to another place. This is how pilots work in Africa. This is done to protect black rhinos, which are considered an endangered species. Through such manipulation, rhinos are distributed throughout Africa, including being transported to inaccessible parts of the continent where there are no trails or roads, that is, where poachers can't reach them. What do you think could go wrong during a parachute jump? Will a skydiver forget to open the parachute? Or forget it on board altogether? That's right. But what about passing out right in freefall? A guy named Christopher jumped down, followed by the instructor who filmed the whole thing. Everything went smoothly at first, but at one point the situation drastically changed. Christopher started to flip in the air, and then he flew down with great speed, leaving the cameraman far behind him. As it turned out, Christopher passed out during the freefall. Fortunately, the instructor managed to bring the situation under control. Having caught up with the falling skydiver, he managed to pull the ring and Christopher's parachute opened. A moment later, the instructor did the same with his parachute, and shortly afterwards, he said, Christopher came to his senses and they both landed safely. That's all, guys. Would you like to skydive? Let me know in the comments. Thank you for watching, and see you later.